It may well be by now you're getting a really kind of interesting insight into the concept of leadership depending on what you've studied so far. But I really want to bring us back to the theoretical underpinnings of leadership and those sort of base theories. I'm going to remind you that we have trait theories of how certain behaviours come about. Obviously think about your personality as an example. We have social learning theories, or SLT, and we have interactionist theories. And this tutorial about leadership is going to be no different to that. So your previous knowledge of those things will be really, really useful. So let's start with trait theory. Now I'm going to potentially offend immediately and refer to the alternative name of the trait theory of leadership. Can I stress the one that I utterly disagree with, and that is that it's referred to as the great man theory. And I'm going to address this point first of all. Trait theories of leadership have traditionally and inherently describe these as male characteristics. Now again, can I tell you that I'm making all of this description in air quotes? I absolutely fundamentally disagree with this sort of notion that leadership is a male characteristic, and we'll go further here, and you can see why I'm using the words like traditional. We're talking here that sons inherit leadership from their fathers. Now that is ridiculous. And of course, it's a very useful mechanism if you want to preserve power structures, for example. So you can see why it's been a popular view, because it sort of upholds the status quo and so on. But obviously, we're not going to be respectful of that particular view. What might be more relevant to consider here is that trait theory suggests that leaders are born leaders. Now, obviously, if we take that in a non-gender specific, that's kind of interesting, right? Is it the case that some behaviours of leadership are actually biological in their nature? They're actually to do ultimately with our genes and alleles and those kinds of things. Now that's a reasonable question, I think, to ask, not necessarily saying I know the answer, but we're also going to argue here that trait theory suggests that leadership is an enduring trait. Now this is no different to, for example, personality. Leadership is an enduring trait, so it lasts a lifetime in essence. And trait theorists would also argue that it's a stable trait. In other words, leadership will emerge in all situations from an individual who's experiencing leadership or has leadership skills. And then it also suggests that social learning is irrelevant. Okay, so leadership is effectively born. As I said before, this is kind of useful if you're already in a position of privilege or leadership, right? Because you can maintain that and prevent others from challenging that. So that's what we mean by the great man theory or the trait theory. Again, can I repeat, the real need for kind of, these are traditional opinions. I really want to suggest this. This is the traditional view, and one which we can really broadly ignore and challenge. Now, whether there's traits involved, I think that's another matter. Now, obviously on the other end of the spectrum here, we have the notion of social learning theory. We know that through social learning theory, it's argued that people learn their behaviours through modelling of significant others, through copying, from mimicry, through vicarious experiences. So can I just reinforce some of those points? Leadership, according to this theory, is learned from others. Okay, that sounds like it might have something to it. Effectively, other people's behaviours rub off on you. That doesn't seem ridiculous. It also would suggest that access to high status role models is really important here, that we copy high status models. Now, we don't copy, for example, leaders who are weak, who fail. We're less likely to do that, right? But also, we're going to, just to reiterate that point, we're going to model on successful leadership. So how we define leadership, therefore, is very important, because if we define it as a very kind of male, masculine, charismatic type thing, as I've talked to you about this potentially before, then of course we're going to sort of model on that behaviour as well, whether that is true leadership or not. It really emphasises the importance of the social environment, of socialisation, for want of a better term. Lovely term, socialisation, or the sum of all the social experiences that a human being might experience. And we can also sort of go back to that kind of Thorndike law type notion and our reinforcement models, because we also know that it's learned better, or more likely it's learned if reinforced. So if an individual experiences reinforcement, then that of course is more likely to lead to that behaviour being replicated. So the importance of reinforcement here is important. Now, one of the criticisms we can make of this model is that it ignores traits. It doesn't take into account traits whatsoever, which is why of course we're going to move on to our final theory, and that being our interactionist approach. So if we now look at the interactionist approach, And again, lots and lots of crossover here with our studies of, for example, personality, but also things like aggression, if you've learned that already. Interactionist approach is that sort of blend. So what we're saying here, really, with the interactionist approach, is that traits and the environment interact. And I really want to give some specific examples here of how that might be the case. Well, I'd like to address this. People might be born with leadership characteristics, let's say empathy, let's say good listening skills, people born with leadership skills, but perhaps more importantly than that, or at least relevantly to that, we've got the notion that the situation brings them out. And if the situation didn't bring them out, they wouldn't be displayed. So it's actually that interaction that's important, the presence of those skills, or the presence of those behaviours, but the situation requiring those. I guess that helps explain why sometimes people seem very kind of passive and more active in different situations. So someone would show innate or biological, of course we could use that term, show innate leadership, so they might have leadership kind of in them. They show innate leadership when the situation demands, it. And of course that's where sport becomes important, because sport is a crucible or an avenue for leadership to be displayed. So maybe that's why we see it coming out of people who don't show leadership in other environments and when they're in that sporting context. And I just want to finish this off with exactly that point. We might have someone who is a leader in sport, let's say a captain, for example, but not elsewhere. That the sport is their vehicle, their crucible, their avenue to display these kinds of characteristics and these behaviours, because the situation has drawn out these innate characteristics. And just to finish off with, I suppose what we'd say is that this is currently the most relevant or best current thinking on leadership. I think it's really important how we define leadership. And if you've watched my tutorials on this stuff, it's important to stress that, because how we define leadership and the breadth of leadership is important to be able to recognise it and therefore to make assumptions about what its origins are. And we tend to have a legacy of sort of defining leadership as a very male characteristic, and I don't think that is accurate at all. Thank you.